Chapter 33 Skulked. Astrid's shoulder knocked against the heavy wooden door of the meat hall as she shuffled inside. The blunt stun hardly registered to her weary body, and she moved onward into the long-abandoned establishment unaffected. She didn't come for the food or the drinks, not that any would be served at this hour, with even the most outstanding sots having long since put to bed. Through the quiet and still village, a salient glow emitted from the hall, which piqued her curiosity, and the noticeable absence of one man for the entirety of the day spurred her into climbing the steps against the protests of a leg wound. She rubbed some dried blood off her chin, carelessly flittering the flakes from her fingers. Really, she just wanted a bath. She got her leg bandaged up from a lucky dragon's claw, got some food in her, and was put straight to work on rebuilding one of their barns, all before the sun had fully risen. Though dead on her feet, Astrid's conscience insisted on seeking out her elusive friend before she could allow herself to lie down for a hard-earned rest. Stiff legs took her to the only source of light within the hall, betraying only the slightest discomfort in her limp. A single candle atop a table teased the shadows stretching beyond its immediate reach, licking a large hunched figure with its ambience. "Fish!" She didn't raise her voice, not when stone and wood tossed it so generously within the vast room. Perhaps spurred by a new sound, Fishlegs muttered something to himself, unintelligible at this distance, and crossed something out on the parchment before him, using a charcoal stick. She took several more steps forward until her good leg touched the corner of the table. "Fishlegs!" The man's head snapped up, this time registering the presence of someone else. His eyes were wide enough for Astrid to see his pupils constrict sharply in the face of a more direct firelight. "Astrid," he blinked a couple of times. "What are you doing here?" If he were shocked at suddenly finding himself not alone in the dark, he didn't show it. In fact, as soon as he acknowledged her company, his eyes went straight back to the scraps of sheepskin scattered before him. "What are you doing here?" she threw back at him. She tossed one leg over the table's bench and seated herself across from him. A twinge in her thigh pulled from beneath her bandages, but it went ignored. The young man released a long breath that somehow sounded like he just lost a very intense game. He tapped something right in front of him with a thick finger. "Here. Right here." Even if she read it right side up, Astrid knew she would make little sense of what he gestured to. There appeared to be symbols she'd never seen before, formulas of some sort, defacing every inch of the parchments. Dates and tallies and lines crossing lines to connect them all. She'd sooner call it witchcraft than logic. "Here what?" She was tired. She wanted a bath. She didn't know why she came up here in the first place. Fishlegs was found right where she suspected he'd be. He was alive and looking more haggard than those who actually fought in the raid the night before. Okay, that part was concerning. Fishlegs tapped that one spot again, his half-lidded eyes never wavering in their focus. "I miscalculated. Right here." His finger continued tapping, as though trapped in some morbid dance to remind him of his blunder. No matter how much Astrid squinted her eyes, she knew the technical meaning of the symbols would be lost on her. "I was wrong," Fishlegs murmured when she didn't immediately say anything. "I thought they were supposed to—" The words wouldn't come to him. Frustrated, Fishlegs pulled his finger from its drum to run his hand through his hair. His helmet had been set on the table, and Astrid could see that he had been mussing up his hair quite often during his time spent in that seat. Much of the very short braid he had taken to wearing had come undone. "I figured tonight would have been the raid, not last, and we weren't—" Then Astrid understood. "Fish," she sighed, unsure of how to handle this in any sort of delicate manner. "Fish, it's fine." His hand stamped on the table, sudden and faster than Astrid thought possible for the man. She heard a faint crack within the profound echo, evidence of a strength he rarely exhibited. "It's not fine," Fishlegs snapped, raising his voice to her for, perhaps, the first time in their lives. A forelock of blonde hair fell into his face, but it went ignored as he used his other hand to gesture wildly to the outside. Look at what happened. 7% casualties, 20% drop in our food supply. Damages that could take weeks we don't have. And it's because Again, the words seemed to have escaped him. Astrid didn't so much as flinch at the atypical display of power. "We were still more prepared than we would have been," she calmly reminded him. "We had already moved most of the livestock into the caves. We had more men on hand because we knew not to send out any expeditions." The reason in the words punctured him, and the Ingerman legatee deflated just as fast as his temper came to him. He settled back into his seat, seeming to bear an even stronger aura of defeat. Astrid frowned at his behavior and the way his shoulders sagged, buckling under a burden she could never understand. She could react in the moment. She could protect what was in front of her with strength and skill she had full control of. But predictions? Calculations? Having an entire village rely on so many unstable chances, interpreted only by her? That simply left too many opportunities to fail, to disappoint. Fishlegs took on this responsibility, a responsibility so out of Astrid's element that she was glad she would never be considered for it. His forecasts were great when accurate, but when they weren't... Now he understood the gravity of bearing this burden alone, of the consequences involved with failure. Consequences that would only grow as Burke came to rely on him more and more. And now Astrid got to witness him fall apart under it. Looking at the worry-edged crevices in his thinning face, Astrid wondered if Stoic realized the pressure this put her classmate under. They had all done their separate things, Snotnut with his training, Toughnut with his excursions, and Roughnut being dragged back and forth between matrons, yet always finding time to complain to Astrid or train for battle. But Fishlegs stayed here, in this corner of the meat hall or in his family house, hunched over letters and notes and plots, growing paler by the day as stress wore him down at a pace to match the fall of their village. The circumstances may be different, but Astrid remembered the resulting sensations well, the feeling of aiming too high and then watching her life slip out of control, the helplessness, the guilt, the rage. She reached a hand across the table and rested it over top of his charts. His lowered eyes riveted on the bloody-knuckled fist. She really needed a bath. "Fish," Astrid began softly. "I want to help." Already he shook his head without wanting to listen to her. "You can't, This isn't something you can help with. It would take too long to teach you. I've enough going on as it is. And you're needed outside, out there. Have you been eating?" She interrupted, scrutinizing his appearance once his stammering of unfinished sentences exposed more of his body to the candlelight. It was not a healthy sort of weight loss that Astrid saw in his face. He looked uneven, saggy, with darkening bags under his eyes and a knot between his brows, likely born from grimacing too often. "I don't know," was Fishleg's odd reply to the question. Disturbance returned to his features, and he scratched at his beard. "I can't think with all this going on. Not about anything else. I can't let this happen again. I need to triple, no, quadruple check my calculations from now on. This was unacceptable. Fish!" Astrid barked, seizing his sputters. She continued in a much softer tone, "Don't do this to yourself. We need you healthy." Finally, he looked at her. His shock at her words quickly morphed into a weak, apologetic smile to expose the premature lines around his mouth. "I'm no fighter." "We need your mind," Astrid immediately countered. She initially would have informed him that they had enough fighters, if that were still true. But Fishlegs had become valuable in a different manner. "You have become our best defense. Do you realize that?" The blond man snorted, wordlessly giving his opinion on that claim. Pride would not keep Astrid from elaborating on something she firmly believed. "Your predictions, your charts. Without them, we would never prepare in time." "But Astrid held up a hand. "You can't always get it right. We realize this. We do. Well, most of us." Fishlegs sagged, but Astrid paid no notice. "We are grateful for what you've given us. I'd hate to think where we would be right now without you." Fishlegs remained rueful. "I actually calculated that out just for the hell of it. You don't need to tell me," Astrid interjected. "I don't actually want to know." The young woman stood, deciding that, while she couldn't quite ease Fishleg's self-inflicted guilt this time, he would at least know his friends hadn't forgotten him. "Get some sleep, and join us tomorrow for drinks. We're going to play horn toss." He shook his head. "I don't have time." "Make time. It's important." She knew. This was their life now. If they couldn't find fun in between raids, then there'd be no fun. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Take care of this." She rapped him on the head with her knuckles. He winced at the sharp pain, massaging the spot with a scowl not of dissatisfaction, but of annoyance. Astrid managed to smile herself. A light-hearted scowl was a step in the right direction as far as she was concerned. She turned on her heel and headed home, her mind now focused on getting to a bed. "Really, get some sleep," she threw over her shoulder before melting into the darkness beyond the doors. Fishlegs stared after her for a short while. "Yeah," he finally mumbled, delayed. His eyes burned in an aberration, and he found he had been rereading the same notes without anything registering in his head. Maybe he did need a nap. His entire day had been spent in that corner, in that seat. He simply couldn't bring himself to go outside and help with repairs. Shame kept him chained to the meat hall, poring over past letters from correspondence, previous chartings of raids, anything to justify what happened. He eventually found it, his mistake. It was an error he could not afford to repeat. He continued to stare down at the papers, his own writing appearing more and more foreign to him. Frustration began to mount within him again. How could he protect their village in the only way he knew how, if his good-for-nothing brain wouldn't work right? He figured out his mistake, but how could he prevent it from happening again? How could he keep up with the growing prevalence of attacks when it took him longer and longer to puzzle out his calculations? "It's not enough," he groaned, running both hands through his hair. "It'll never be enough." Shadows were, arguably, the most important aspect of the night. They were perfect for concealment, people tended to avoid them, and when read correctly they behaved as omens of warning. Every movement, every subtle flicker spoke to Hiccup loud and clear against the stillness of the night, and that's what got him so far into the village of Berk in the darkest, most quiet phase of the moon. The layout of the village generally remained as he remembered it, though the number of houses in his memory had diminished. Hiccup could easily interpret the signs of a recent raid with so much of the village scorched and broken, and a hodgepodge of lumber and supplies piled around the land. Hopefully, that meant he had some time before the next one. A shadow on the ground darkened and jumped. The elongating, sinister marks against the sparsely grassed soil warned Hiccup of a watchguard's approach long before the man passed. Hiccup spun mid-step and slithered around the back end of the structure he hugged, an unrepaired home, unroofed and blackened by fire. He didn't think about the fate of the family that once lived there. He had to focus on his mission and on not getting caught. The soft skin of his footwear molded lightly into the dirt to move him soundlessly out of sight, just in time for a night guard to march by. Hiccup's eyes followed the shadows on the ground until they receded enough for him to deem it safe to move again. He continued his route around the ruins, darting to a cleaner area the first chance he got. It wasn't safe near so much wreckage. He could easily step on some littered, hollow wood and give away his position. Then again, it wasn't safe near erected homes either, where any night owl could glance out the window and squint through the night. In truth, Hiccup wasn't too worried about that. He wore his darkest cloak and carried himself too well to be caught by a village only accustomed to upfront attacks. He already made it from the lower edge of the forest, across the wooden bridge, and beelined straight through the center of the village, above the port, but below the chief's hill, and past several farmhouses. He covered the largest, most open spans of ground when heavy clouds moved across the moon. He stuck to the walls of the nearest building, favoring the backside of houses, staying away from doors and windows. He had been smart so far. He had been lucky so far. Now he faced off a final rope bridge that connected Berk to its closest isolated sea stack, his destination right at his fingertips. Hiccup began to pad across it in much slower movements than the one he encountered earlier. Moving any faster on a swinging bridge would only cause unwelcome clamor. He adhered to one side, stepping only where rope knotted between wood. He kept his weight lifted and away from the center of the boards. Boards he knew suffered under great weight almost daily and would moan at the slightest bereavement. Despite his efforts, soundlessly traveling its length proved impossible, as every pressure beneath his foot elicited a squeak. Much pausing and listening occurred over the period of crossing. Thankfully, the bridge was short, and soon enough Hiccup's feet rested firmly and safely on a narrow patch of grass. His eyes trailed up the reaching spiral of stone steps carved into the stacked rock by his forefathers and used as one of Berg's many watchtowers. Admittedly, these watchtowers served a more effective purpose during a time when baneful, seafaring neighbors were their greatest issue. Because this particular lookout was closest to the village, reachable by that one bridge, it provided a more diverse purpose. If Hiccup's memory served him correctly, he should find a watchguard at the top and what he was looking for. The young infiltrator coasted up the stairs, using his hands to even out his weight, straining his ears for the slightest hint of being followed, and his eyes for any movement ahead. He reached the summit of the steep islet in no time and dove towards the lone man-made structure. He pressed himself against its tall foundation in a crouch, holding a hand to his mouth to make sure his breath was as even as it sounded. Then he slowly straightened until the top of his head reached the crest of the half-wall. Hiccup took a moment to watch the shadows play on one of the 8 pillars upholding the roof. Shadows delivered not by candlelight, but by a free-sided moon broken by the ocean. When nothing disturbed the mesmerizing pattern for a while, he risked peeking over the open-faced structure. A watchguard was there, all right. His feet kicked up on the railing, balancing his weight on the back legs of his chair. A horned helmet had been tipped forward to cover his eyes, and a soft snore drifted from a partially open mouth. Perfect. No one would have to be drugged this time. With hands braced on the banister, Hiccup tightened his core and lifted himself up with an inhalation. He paused again once his feet were planted next to his grip, balanced on the barrier, and openly visible to the guard should he wake. The Viking gave a mighty snort and mumbled something about bog burglars. Despite himself, Hiccup grinned. He hopped off the wall, his landing as silent as his arrival, and he crept to the cages lining the wall behind the guard. Nearly a dozen beady eyes glared back at him from behind wooden bars. The rest of the messenger hawks had their heads tucked under their wings. Hiccup lowered himself to a cage near the bottom, one whose vacancy would be less noticeable, and chose a bird that already watched him. Startling a hawk into wakefulness would only invite the opportunity for noise.
"Then, with the shekels, please."
Hiccup's shoulders seized at the words. Biting his lip, he glanced back at the guard, but the man had moved neither feet nor helmet. Soon the snores continued, and Hiccup was eased into realizing the sudden speech could be blamed on sleep-talking. He released his lip to bite the inside of his cheek in a half-hearted attempt to keep from chuckling. He returned to his task, his fingers unlatching the cage with some fumbles in the poor lighting. The cage opened with a feeble whine. Both hands reached in, and Hiccup carefully brought the bird out with a firm but gentle hold over its wings. Fortunately, the bird had been handled enough. It chirped at being touched, but made no louder sound. Hiccup repeatedly checked behind him through the entire process to make sure the guard didn't stir. Then he attempted to bag the hawk with the sack he had stuffed into his belt as delicately as he could without causing a commotion. Unfortunately, the hawk was not as open to this idea of transportation. It cried out once the heavy material fell over its head, the bag bulging out in different areas as the trapped animal beat its wings from within. "Shh! Shh!" Hiccup clamped down on his own panic, attempting to soothe the bird with the same calming aura that he used with dragons. His hand slowly closed in around the bagged creature, easing a more secure vice around its wings, but his wary eyes remained on the guard. Who could possibly be the worst choice for a guard in the history of bad guard choices? If the guard did awaken, Hiccup was more than ready to throw caution to the wind and make a break for it. The man didn't awaken, and eventually the bird did settle, either giving up on a bid for freedom or simply accepting its new setting for what it was. It released the occasional soft cry as Hiccup jostled it to stand. The guard released another snort and muttering something else. A bandaged hand came up to wipe at his chin. Every movement from the Viking sent a painful thrill through Hiccup's heart. His blood pounded in his ears and throat so strongly he thought he might throw up, but he couldn't deny the excitement he felt from being so close to success. Success that could just as easily escape him with one wrong move. The bird rustled from within the bag, and Hiccup knew he had to make a speedy escape before it lost its temper and really caused a racket. He crept back to the half-wall, quickly figuring out a smooth way of carrying the bird without disturbing it too much.
"Kami, you..."
Hiccup stalled one hand on the rail, the gently shifting bag tucked under the other. He turned to squint at the guard, sure he had heard wrong.
They so big.
Hiccup knew he had to leave. He got what he came for, undetected, and he could make an equally polished escape. Kicking the chair out from under the watchguard would be immature and impractical. He stared at the visible jaw a little longer. He swore that he knew this guy from somewhere. He recognized that obnoxious birthmark staining the gullet of fat beneath his chin. Even with meager visibility he could see it. Good gods. Grody Gutterson. Hiccup remembered now. The mace wielder, 4 years his senior, who always found it funny to pretend to lose control over his mace far too close to Hiccup's face. Hiccup still felt uncomfortable around Spikes. The fat chops smacked a couple of times. Some drool on the corner of Grody's mouth glistened in the moonlight. The bag rustled, and Hiccup knew he really had to leave. Grabby grab. Really, he should leave. Grody's fingers began twitching in a squeezing fashion. Toothless netted the ground with his claws, alternating paws, gouging the earth to express some of his agitation. The dark and quiet village had remained so for the duration of his everlasting wait. It was maddening. How long did Hiccup expect him to just sit there, lying in wait? The boy nearly laid an egg when Toothless tried to make an argument for flying towards the destination. Hiccup made it quite clear that he didn't want Toothless anywhere near the village. Not even the skies were safe as far as the former resident was concerned. So Toothless complied with the boundary Hiccup had laid down for him at the forest's edge, with the promise to stay put so long as Hiccup returned unharmed.
I'll be back in a skip, don't worry. It's not like they'll have changed the layout of the village. I can take care of myself.
Yeah, care for himself straight into another weapon. It took his boy nearly 2 full days to recover from the sickness that had followed him from the nest. Hiccup tried to leave the previous night, but Toothless deemed him too pale and postponed this cunning plan a full day. They did, however, relocate to the cove whence their friendship started. This left their 2 tag-alongs in the safety of Koltur, as Hiccup called it, an island that apparently lay just outside the demon's reach. Toothless believed for this to be best. The 2 dragons had their own recovery to undergo, and Toothless would not risk Hiccup's safety if they suddenly lost their minds again. They seemed to be holding up fine. Neither bore any crippling injuries, and they could hunt and fly away to their content. Both, oddly enough, chose to stay on that island. Though they shared an open curiosity about the human who chose to save them, something that predisposed them to Hiccup's affections, Toothless knew they suffered from a rebounding pride. One that filled them with a horrific comprehension he himself remembered all too well. They would want their own revenge on that demon. Toothless's ears perked up at a promising sound. Feet beating against the ground, barely audible to a human, but familiar and wonderful and approaching. His eyes gleamed in the dark, catching Hiccup sprinting across the stone bridge, cradling a large sack in his arms. Toothless bounced straight out of the trees and met Hiccup before the boy could take so much as 3 steps away from the bridge.
"We're good,"
Hiccup whispered excitedly, easily ignoring the dragon snout that sniffed him head to toe. "You're okay?"
"I'm fine."
Toothless could see Hiccup's eyes shining in a light only useful to creatures such as himself. Those freckled cheeks were flushed from the run, and his hair looked a bit wild, but the smile on his face eased Toothless's own worries. The human grimaced and prodded the bag.
"I hope this guy is."
The bird had been unusually quiet for the end portion of his escape, around the time when he thought, to hell with it, and decided to straight out run to his dragon. He lost patience with the sneaking thing, fun as it may be. The poke elicited a squawk from within, and the burlap once more became animated. "I still don't see why this was necessary," Toothless commented. Hiccup swung himself into the saddle, accidentally knocking the bird against Toothless's shoulder. He winced at its loud caw.
"I told you, I need to contact my father."
Something he realized he wasn't willing to do face to face. Not yet, anyway. It was a situation that simply left too much room for disaster, with or without Toothless in the picture. There are easier ways, I'm sure.
"But I might need constant contact. Like, he'll reply, but then I'll need to reply to that reply, but he'll be waiting for me if I delivered the first note more personally."
Toothless snorted. Hiccup pursed his lips.
Look, I don't want to take my chances with him. Who knows what his feelings are about all this?
Hiccup gestured to himself and Toothless.
This way we can have a normal, acceptable correspondence, for as long as we'll need it to go on, until we reach an understanding. I just need to initiate it, since he doesn't know I'm around.
And the bird is the best way to go about this?
Well, my first instinct was to send to Terra,
Hiccup said seriously.
But I wasn't sure if he'd sent it back.
Yeah, I get it. Toothless sighed. I suppose nothing disastrous happened this time. He didn't hear any shouts or alarms for the duration of Hiccup's absence.
Told you it wouldn't.
Hiccup grinned. He settled the agitated bird in his lap more securely.
Let's go.
Can I eat that when we're done?
No.
Stoke the vase stretched his arms above his head and released a mighty groan to coincide with his popping back. He slept hard that night. A long battle followed by a day of repairs would send any man into a sound sleep. He started his way down to the village square, one jouncing step after another. He felt good that morning, better than he could remember feeling in years. The damage wasn't too bad this time around, and they already made good progress in revival. Their most recent hunting trip procured enough kill to last them possibly a month, if the meat held. They'd have to trade for salts and spices soon, but the immediate future looked about as positive as life on Burr could get. "Repairs going all right?" asked his brother when his John brought him to Spiteloud's side. The great brunette nodded, his fists resting on each hip as he surveyed the speedy repairs of the Halfman household. "Aye, just about finished with this level." Spiteloud raised an eyebrow as he cast Stoic a sly look. "Slept in pretty late, don't you think?" "Shut it, you. I ain't as young as I used to be." He swore he felt something pull around his lower spine when he grappled with that zippleback. "If you think that is an excuse, you are sorely mistaken." Both brothers jerked when the wavering voice materialized right behind them and bent their necks downwards to find the village elder smiling benignly. "Morning, ma'am," Stoic immediately greeted. "Elder?" Spiteloud nodded out of respect, though his brow furrowed. The little old woman laughed without reserve. "All the tracking skills in the world cannot compete with a lifetime of skulking." "How can you be so sprightly?" Stoic voiced. His back still felt sore from whatever he did to it 2 nights ago. If he were on a downward spiral into elderhood, he couldn't imagine ever being so cheerful as that in 20 years. "Oh, she's great, if her aim is anything to go by," the resident blacksmith growled, trailing a good pace behind the elder. Gobber favored his back leg, precariously hopping on the tapered wood more than he would step on his left foot. The elder sniffed. "Maybe you will learn to not throw old Brian in the path of a poor elderly woman." "He probably didn't hear you coming," Spiteloud offered for his friend, but a smile had warmed its way over his face. "Aye," his brother spoke up with a wink. "The consequences of a lifetime of skulking." Gobber shuffled up to the group. Yeah, consequences of skulking. In that case, I doubt we'll notice when she's skulking croaks." The elder rapped him on the leg with her cane for what would be the second time that morning. "Ah, woman, I only got one leg." Spiteloud slapped Gobber upside the head. "Respect the elder." "But I'm just ensuring that my death will be a cause for celebration rather than mourning," the elder justified with black humor. "I expect only the finest ale to be served, and for my pyre to consist of aspen wood. I want my amber amulet around my neck and my silver one in my hand. I want my 3 golden torques around my wrist. The 4th one, my daughter will know, will go to my youngest grandchild. And I want there to be dancing. There better be more than just my pyre lit." The man took a moment to stare at her. "You've been planning this for a while, haven't you?" Stoic deadpanned. "Hey!" The party of 4 turned to see Toughnut Thorsten marching by, shouldering one end of a timber stack, with the other side held up by his sister. "This village isn't going to rebuild itself, you know." He didn't wait for a response. He kept on walking with his sister, harping at his back. Stoic's eyebrows rose. "Uppity little. Och, he's just annoyed that the hunting party got postponed." Gobber waved. "And a good thing, too. Can you imagine if we didn't have enough men? That would have been—" The piercing call of a hawk punctured Gobber's words. The men craned their necks to see the magnificent bird of prey circle their heads once before swooping down to settle on Stoic's quickly outstretched arm. He pulled the letter from the tie around the bird's leg and moved his arm next to Spitelout so the courier could hop onto the new perch. "Uh-oh," Gobber muttered as Stoic unfurled the correspondence. "That's mighty early for the devil dogs to respond." "No, it's from Hiccup," Stoic's voice pitched. He had gotten better since his son's departure. His focus on the village and the fiasco of a war helped stabilize him against the inner upheaval of emotions. It allowed him to put Hiccup's actions to the back of his mind so the rest could move forward. When he did think of Hiccup, he tried to think of only that last letter they received nearly a year ago. Hiccup gave them a note worthy of a chief in training, diplomatic, neutral, and opening a world of possibilities to further explain his abandonment. On a good day, Stoic could even make the argument that Hiccup had helped their village. "What's it say?" his brother asked quietly from his side. Stoic swallowed and read the entirety of the note aloud. "Stoic of Burke, I write to you to inform you that I've returned to the archipelagos. My research on this war is both extensive and thorough, and I've recently made some alarming discoveries that I feel you need to know about. I've been to the nest." Here Stoic had to pause. I've seen this demon that controls the dragons. It does not look good for the Vikings. I request a meeting to discuss these discoveries on neutral ground, and that we might find a way to work together to defeat this thing. I hope we can form a temporary truce. It only has to hold for the duration of the war, and then we can go our separate ways. Please reply with haste. Hiccup. Wow, Gobber muttered when Stoic did little more than stare at the letter after finishing his read. Whoa. He couldn't quite think of anything else to say. Aye, Stoic whispered. This here is heavy stuff, the smith settled on. Again, he doesn't sound feral, Spitelout added. Still using that brain of his. He even got himself a messenger hawk. Does he now? The elder spoke up, reminding the men of her presence. She stared at the bird with high eyebrows. Spitelout followed her gaze to the marker strapped around its scaly leg, the claim of property, the Burkean red tag. He blinked. Is that ours? The men all leaned closer to the hawk. There was no mistaking it. They had each used this particular hawk before, several times. How did he... Bugger, Gobber swore. He was in a village. Or he has a contact here who sent him the bird, Spitelout offered, though the bird would have to be introduced to him again for that to be remotely useful. Either way, he's close, Stoic murmured, troubled by the very idea of Hiccup's presence in their village. His brother shook his head. Riding a dragon? Said Spitelout. He could easily hop the islands. Could be halfway back to Shetland by now. Gobber went on muttering. What was the daft fool thinking? He could have been attacked. That little shite. Stoic ignored Gobber's ill-hid worries over Hiccup's well-being in the face of an outlaw infiltrating their village for thievery because, despite himself, he felt that same initial concern. Call a meeting. You can't be serious, Hawk cried, always the traditionalist. After what he's done to us, you're actually thinking of... What's he done exactly? Gobber broke through. Warned us not to waste our time seeking for the nest. Gave us some insight to the mechanics behind this war. Certainly didn't deprive us of a dragon fighter, Eck mumbled, winning a few chuckles and a few more frowns. Which hasn't been proven, a voice hollered from the back in response to Gobber's defense. He says he can, though, another argued back. Enough! Stoic growled, and silence fell over the entire gathering. Look at us! Look at what we've become! Those present did so. The gathering was far larger than the usual ting, but that was because every one of the fighting sort were present. This was all they had left for a defense. Stoic followed his own advice, finding more difficulty in spotting fellows of his own age with every meeting. The seasoned warriors of the tribe helped them greatly in keeping Burke afloat, but the younger generation was more able-bodied. They survived, learning how to fight dragons in the most cutthroat manner possible, and fast. Soon enough, they would surpass their parents. At Stoic's right stood his most trusted counsel, his brother, the elder, his best friend. but it was to his left that he turned. This was where he kept the future of the village, his nephew, the Ingerman boy whose logic proved just as valuable as any well-wielded blade, and the Hofferson lass with whom he saw himself in the more he scrutinized her. Ironic, considering her hand in the removal of his son. He watched as young Astrid arose from her depression using the same crutch as he, the war. She relied on image and example to lead her peers, and it worked. She trusted their system of government. She put the good of the whole before the individual. How had he not seen the similarities before? He should have adopted the lass. She was the child he wished Hiccup had been. Snotlout he continued to hold reservations for. The boy was trying, Odin knew it, and he had made leaps and bounds with redefining himself, even if pure selfish ambition clearly drove him. But the boy could still be manipulated. Somewhere in Stoic's mind, the idea that Astrid could take over the village continued to niggle. Pity. If they hadn't already made the contract with the Bogs, it would have been a perfect way to get her into power. But he was willing to cut his losses in that area and simply let her do what she did best, protect. Fishlegs. The sound of his own voice shocked Stoic, and he quickly remembered where he was. He turned to the large man, whose fingers seemed to have spasmed tightly around the clutch of papers at the sound of his name.
Take the floor, son.
Stoic gestured to an open spot beside him.
I'd like to hear your take on this.
Second, Astrid called out. Fishlegs stared at her, bewildered, and she smiled.
Aye.
Somewhere else shouted from across the table, and from there more voices raised, all calling for Fishlegs' opinion. The young man stiffly accepted the call. He walked to the forefront of the gathering, positive that everyone could see him shaking. This wasn't the first time he'd been asked to speak up at the ting, but he still felt that senseless, crippling fear every time he fell under the scrutiny of so many eyes. This fear whispered things to him, tried to freeze the blood in his legs from spurring him forward, tried to force him back into the solitude where he belonged. It tried to remind him that he didn't fit here. He didn't deserve this authority to make decisions for the good of this village. He was a farmer's son, and he was a coward. How had it spiraled into this? A simple project bred from curiosity turned into a driving factor behind his village's defense strategies. All because Hiccup's actions, leaving the village and on a dragon no less, seemed so outlandish that Fishlegs couldn't possibly leave well enough alone. Treasonous as his thoughts may have been, the blonde felt Hiccup might have been onto something, a key in these raids that went previously undiscovered. He began charting dragon attacks and frequencies, sent out inquiries to other villages known to suffer attacks. He talked to sailors about their widely reached knowledge, slowly marking out a disturbing pattern with all the data collected. Naturally, he deemed it best to keep his studies under wraps for fear of being outlawed like Hiccup. That had always been a fear of Fishlegs. A shameful, dirty fear that left him too weak to stand up to popular opinion, but just strong enough to ignore the loneliness he saw in the eyes of an old childhood friend. But when his intelligence became too much to keep to himself, Fishlegs gathered all the courage he had in his body and brought it to the attention of the chief. And that's when the responsibility began to pile up. The situation terrified him, but Fishlegs sucked in his gut and met the challenge head on. Because his data got him premature access to things, and he learned that Hiccup was still trying to help their village in his own peculiar way. Hiccup was still being Hiccup, socially unacceptable and persevering, two qualities that he avoided and lacked respectively. This would be his contribution to his village. He had the size of a berserker, but he didn't have the heart of one. He wasn't like Tough or Rough or Astrid. They'd start bellowing one moment and lose themselves to the movement in the next. Fishlegs had trouble attacking dragons ever since dragon training, when he looked into that Dippleback's eyes and saw intelligence gleaming back at him. He couldn't work up the sheer rage and aggression needed for that state of mind. His mind was destined for a different purpose. This would be his redemption, for every time he stood on the sidelines and did nothing.
Well, according to my charts, and these I've checked multiple times, mind you, we are on what I would call a downward spiral. They'll be attacking more and more often, and eventually our recovery won't be able to keep up. He turned his eyes downward. Estimate a total annihilation within a year.
That got an ill-favored response. Gasps wove around the gathering like the very spiral Fishlegs spoke of.
If If Hiccup has more information, this can increase our chances of survival exponentially, Fishsticks continued in a slightly louder voice that quieted most of the mutterings. Need I remind you, he has helped us before. We would only have a fraction of you here with us now if we had continued with the nest hunts. And now his voice gained strength. I know because I made my own predictions regarding that using the average number of persons missing of past expeditions and factoring in the increase of dragons spotted during... He stopped when he realized no one actually cared how he figured this out. Anyway, his information of the past has helped us before, and I believe we are in no position to decline his offer of a truce. We can only benefit from this, and we can no longer afford to be picky about where we get help. Astrid leaned against a wooden pillar with her arms crossed, content to blend into the shadows as Fishlick slowly turned the minds of those opposed to the idea. Though she had known about his hand in helping the village for weeks, it still amazed her to see how far Fishlicks had come. She used to shake her head at him back when they were kids, back when he would run screaming from anything with sharp teeth, refusing to use the powerful body he had been gifted with. As an older man, Fishlicks knew better than to put himself in situations like that. He focused on his strengths, even if they weren't the traditional sort, and he made himself useful. Astrid found she could respect him for that. She only wished that she could figure herself out as her peers came into their own. No one had tried to pursue her in weeks, and her damned wishy-washy mind was once more thankful. Did she really experience the odd feelings of being left behind? Yes, but ever since discovering the dark truth behind the war, Astrid's deeper involvement in their defense spiced things up again. It filled some of that emptiness inside her. These predictions gave a sense of progress. She felt less a pawn and more a player, as she deserved to be. Still, that confusion regarding what she truly desired for herself continued to torment her every now and then, popping up whenever she had too much time to introspect and teasing her for failing to understand her own heart. She wanted to be great at everything. They were Vikings, Burkians. They fought and married, and then they fought some more. Astrid was suited just fine for the fighting part, but her heart pulled when she saw everyone taking the next step in their lives, while she stayed still, like they were growing up without her. Marriage, children, these were milestones she was expected to cross, and her expectations for herself dictated that she meet every expectation and beyond. She feared the twisted combination of expectations. Inadequacy and obligation drove this aimlessness, because when she really stepped back, when she took out tradition and prospect and everything her village represented, she swore her heart wasn't fully into the idea of a settled life. Once upon a time, perhaps, but now... Unfortunately, these were factors that influenced her future. She wouldn't abandon her village. She couldn't set aside those expectations or ignore tradition. It wasn't in her nature. She wanted Burke to be proud of her. When Burke was proud of her, she was happy. So Astrid continued her struggle with figuring out how to manage what she wanted, if she even knew what she wanted, while her village fell to ruin. Sometimes she was grateful for the war. She could focus on at least one thing she loved, and it had given her an excuse to escape every offer for her hand so far. Other times she dreaded the day when it all ended, in or out of their favor.
"So we're in an accord," Stoic's bellow jerked Astrid from her meditation. She completely missed what they were agreeing on. The room roared back in a series of eyes. She caught Fishlegs shuffling backwards from the spotlight, still looking pale, but also relieved. "Then it's agreed. We'll meet with them," Stoic decided, and his face remained so unreadable, so unmoved by what was surely a crippling verdict, that Astrid wondered how they could ever find a chief to replace him. "Until further notice, no one is to harm Hiccup should they encounter him." Despite her knowing it would be the best, logical move Burke could make, Astrid felt her stomach drop. It looked like Hiccup would be returning to Burke, and conceivably with a suspended sentence. They would face each other again after such a bitter parting, and there wasn't much she could do about it. He had intelligence that could possibly save their village, information no one could ever acquire before. He betrayed their village in the process, but because Fishlegs vouched for him, it was going to happen. He would return. Her eyes chose that moment to seek out the broad shoulders of the blonde as he moved with the flow of the crowd. He stood at least a head taller than most surrounding him, and he could easily shove his way to the front, but instead he allowed for his body to be knocked around, stuttering apologies. Astrid shook her head. When did the two losers of the generation become the two most influential?